So here is the third webinar organized by CEPR with the Graduate Institute in Geneva, based on papers published in COVID economics. Today we are very pleased to welcome Chris Pissarides, Esper Moon, and Pietro Garibaldi. The seminar, the presentation, I think, by Chris will last 40 minutes, and then there will be time for a discussion with the three authors. There is this facility where you can chat on the side with the co-authors, but it's probably not a good idea if you have questions. You can do that if you have particular points, but otherwise keep the questions for after the presentation, so we have a lively discussion. When you want to ask questions, you please click raise your hands. Chris will welcome brief clarifying questions during his presentation. Substantive questions should be at the end, again using the raise your hand function. All yours, Chris.
Thank you very much, Charles. Let me share the screen. Okay, here we go. Well, you can see here the title of our talk, which is modeling the context and the transitions in the SIR model, which is becoming a model very familiar with economists, and my two co-authors are Pietro Garibaldi and Esper Moon, who are in this webinar as well. Now I have an introduction here about the SIR model, because when we wrote the paper, the SIR model was new to economists. It's about 100 years old model, and there are essentially, in the simplest version, there are three states where the individual goes through. The susceptible state is that basically healthy individuals could get infected. The infected state are the ones who have the disease, and the recovery state or the removal state are the ones who come out of the infected state. I'm moving fast here because most of you, if not all, will be familiar with this model, and I want to focus more on the new things that we have to say. The key features of this model are that initially, at the very beginning, a very small number of people are infected. The I set, if you like, contains a sort of epsilon number. And then through contacts between I and S, we get more people infected, and people move from S to I. And then they recover through treatment. There are deaths in there, which we're assuming away with this paper. And they move on to the recovery state. Now, the S being very large in the beginning declines monotonically, and R being 0 in the beginning, because people haven't had the disease, increases monotonically, whereas the infected state in between, the number first go up as more and more people get infected, and then towards the end, the I goes down. Now, the point at which I turns is the point where the reproduction number, as it's now called, has become quite a famous number, at least in the UK. We get daily on our TV what the number is currently. When it drops to 1 at the point where, at the turning point, which is also the point at which the infected people is at their maximum, and then declines monotonically. And it's one significant result here is that the, maybe shown in this slide here, is that when the disease goes away, there is herd immunity, which I'm sure almost all of you have heard of it, which is the case where the I set goes to 0, whereas there are still susceptible people. So not everyone gets the disease before it's removed from the system altogether. Now, the contact rates, which are the ones that we're going to model, here on this slide, I set out the contact rates in general in the SIR model. And then I'm going to say what specific assumptions we're making, that there is a contact rate M, which is the contact rate between the susceptible and the infected, sorry, between susceptible and anyone else in this economy. K is the probability that the contact between a susceptible individual and an infected individual leads to an infection for the healthy person. It's a medical constant. We don't do anything with it. It gives you the extremes. If K is equal to 1, the disease is extremely infectious. If K is equal to 0, the disease is not infectious at all. In general, gamma is the rate at which people get cured. So 1 over gamma is the mean duration of treatment, which is also a medical parameter. And as you model doctor decisions and the efficiency of hospitals, which again is something that we're not doing here. And we're assuming that the population is constant, so there are no births, natural deaths, or deaths from the disease. No births and natural deaths is a natural assumption to make, in the sense that the dynamics here are much more short-term than natural deaths or births or deaths. Now, deaths from the disease, you might want to take into account a more general model, but remember that there are only about 1 or 2% of the disease persons anyway, so it is a small number. Under those assumptions, the entry from S to I, or the flow, if you like, from S to I is given by M. M, remember, is the contact with everyone. So I are the infected people. I over N is the probability that a contact leads to a contact with an infected person. Multiply that by K. It gives you the probability that the person who is in S gets infected. And therefore, all the people that get infected in any period of time is S times that probability. The exit from I to R is gamma R, as I said before. So the reproduction rate is simply the ratio of the two, which you see in the bottom line here. Let me move on to our modeling assumptions. K, M, and gamma are usually taken as exogenous in the epidemiological model when epidemiologists use SIR, or they're dependent on policy. We endogenize M, but they keep the others as exogenous. There's been a very large number of papers recently by economists, most of them published in COVID economics of the CEPR, under the auspices of our chairman here, that endogenize various of these movements, but the ones that do endogenize movements have endogenize M mostly. We assume that the population is homogeneous. One possible extension in the future would be to assume heterogeneity, because we know that in the case of COVID-19, there are heterogeneities. And since there are no population changes and it's homogeneous, we just assume that we normalize everything to unit population size. We use discrete time in what comes, and then we show some simulations as well in discrete time, but we have perfect foresight of the probabilities and the rates involved. As I say, this is work in progress. We are extending and proving more results as we speak. Now, what else do we do in the modeling? Well, we're assuming that the utility function has two activities. One is a market activity or a social activity, and the other one is a home activity. We split them into two. Obviously, in a more general model, you might want to have a continuum of things you could do at home and in the market, and there are already papers that tell us what fraction of an occupation can be, how many tasks in an occupation can be done at home and how many in the market. Here we just split them in two because this part is the sort of simple. We want to keep it as simple as possible. So we're assuming that the home activity, which is X H, involves no contact, whereas X of S involves contact with another individual with some probability that is given by this contact function, which is, so obviously we're motivating it given our background, most three of us were motivated from the matching function of certain matching theory. That's where the symbol M came from. What we're assuming is that as you increase your social activities, you're increasing the probability that you will get the disease. The key contribution of our paper is to introduce a rational choice of the two activities, X of H and X of S, and show how that influences the given rational forward-looking behavior under the probabilities that I've been giving you. And we show that how that influences the flows of people between the susceptible and the infected state. And in particular, does free choice lead to voluntary social distancing? Is it socially efficient? How does it affect the state of herd immunity? Does it take time to reach it? How long does it take? There are all these important questions that we keep hearing in our news all the time. Now, let me give you the main results. And these are that we do get social distancing, which is voluntary. It gives you a variable number of infected people along the equilibrium trajectory. So it's rather difficult to draw phase diagrams that some people have been doing, for example, which assumes constant parameters. These are changing all the time as we go along. There is a big drop in social activities when compared with the models that epidemiologists use. And we show as a result of that, herd immunity is reached with a lower aggregate number of people infected. In other words, we show that the number of people who avoid the disease is higher in a model with endogenous social distancing than what epidemiologists get by assuming a constant X effectively in our notation. And in fact, we even show that in some of the simulations that I'm going to show you later, that the number of people who avoid the disease altogether, that herd immunity, is reached at the point where, at the maximum possible point for not infected people. I say here, is that a general result? I think it is a general result that we get fewer infections in the cumulative sense, but it's not a general result that we get exactly the maximum number. You could have more infections than consistent with the maximum susceptible set in the limiting state. Now, importantly, there are many inefficiencies here. There are 4 that we highlight even in this simple model. The first one is that there are contact externalities because the contact function is likely to have increasing returns to scale. I'm going to give you a motivation for that. And when there are increasing returns to scale, then the planner will want to impose more social distancing than private people. The increasing returns come from the fact that you infect other people when you meet with someone. If you meet with a group of people who, if you are infected and you meet with a group of people who are not infected, then you will infect all of them. That's where the increasing returns come from. The medical externalities come from congestion in the treatment for the disease. And we're modeling here by saying that if there are more infected people, the hardships that the sick person suffers during treatment increase. Then there are contagion externalities that come from the fact that that if you get infected, if you are now not infected and you get infected, then in future you are going to infect more people. So it comes from our value functions and the dynamics that those value functions have. And all these go in favor of more social distancing imposed in the optimal state than in the equilibrium decentralized state. The final one is one that's been quite controversial here in the UK, which we're calling the immunity externality. And what that says is that the social planner might want to get to herd immunity quickly, and therefore she might want to allow people to get infected faster in the beginning, that what the decentralized equilibrium will do, so as to get there faster. Obviously, you know, if I give you 4 of them and one goes against the other 3, you don't know which one will dominate in the in equilibrium. It will depend on parameter values. Now, our contribution then from what you've seen is the introduction of this contact function, which changes a lot of things in this model, endogenizes the flow from susceptible to infected. And I will talk a little bit more about this function. Suppose that X bar of S is the average in the economy as a whole, then we believe that it will have increasing returns to scale. In fact, I'm not going to show you simulations with increasing returns to scale, but it's an assumption that you should be bearing in mind. I use here an example about people going out only once a day. If I go to a coffee bar to buy a coffee, then obviously I meet the person who serves me a coffee, the barista, but suppose that there are 2 other people who happen to be in the queue in front of me buying coffee, then I basically meet 3 people if I go once, if everyone goes out once. Now, if we all go out twice, I'm not going to meet just 6 people, because each time I will go, the 2 people in front of me in the queue will become 4 because everyone goes out twice. So I end up meeting 10 people instead of 3. That's the source of the increase in returns. Now, if you need sort of a slightly more formal explanation in terms relating it to the economics literature, then the reason and the biggest difference with the matching function of labor economics is that in the matching function, if you have a firm with a vacancy and now you get twice as many people applying for that job as before, there is still only 1 person who gets the job. And each one of those twice as many people who apply will have a lower probability of getting the job because of competition. That's what we call in search theory the congestion externality, which is negative. Here, however, there is no congestion externality. If there is 1 infected person in a coffee bar and now twice as many people walk into the coffee bar as before, you will get twice as many infected people. So the disease, in a sense, is non-exhaustible. It's like a public bad that everyone is suffering from if they come into contact. And that's basically the reason for the increasing returns to scale. Now, interestingly, the intuition I've given you for the increasing returns to scale in the contact function of the SIR model is very, very close to the one that Peter Darmon gave in 1982 in his famous coconut model for increasing returns to scale in the matching function. Now, what Darmon ignored, of course, then, that was shown in later work, was that he ignored the congestion externalities that come in labor markets, in that if you have a coconut, only 1 person can get your coconut. You cannot share it out with everyone that you come across. Here, we don't have a congestion externality. So in a way, Darmon's intuition works perfectly for the epidemics model, although it didn't work for the labor model. Okay, now to the modeling, given that contact function that I motivated before. Now in discrete time, M is your probability of meeting someone from the entire set. We're assuming that you don't have information who is infected, who is recovered, and who is susceptible. You just see a bunch of people out there. M is the probability you come into contact with them. K is the probability that if that person happens to be infected, you get the disease. And the probability, given that the population is equal to 1, the fraction of the population that is infected is I. Therefore, multiply that Km times I. It gives the probability that you will meet an infected, that you will get the disease because you met an infected person. And therefore, the number of people who get infected with large numbers is S times that Km of I. Now, if you look at equation 3, before I tell you about the others, that gives you the rate at which the set of the number of susceptible people declines. So St plus 1 minus St is that number of people that flow from S to I. Now, we're assuming that all infected individuals move to the recovery state after one period. That's the definition of a period in the case of COVID, that you might think of that as being 2 weeks, approximately. And therefore, the rate at which the recovery state, this is equation 5, increases is the number of people who recover from the infected state, and that's the entire number in the previous period, and therefore the change, the first difference, the number of recovered people is equal to the IT of the period before. And that leaves us with the middle equation 4, which increases at the rate of at which S decreases and decreases at the rate at which R increases. And therefore, you see that difference in the square brackets there. Now, before actually I give you the maximization, let me mention one other thing here that maybe we should have mentioned. If you look at equation 4, then you can see, and other than the assumption, which is always the case in these models, that I is bell-shaped, that increases at first and then decreases in an epidemic. You can see that I goes to that stationary point, that turning point, when that Km times S is equal to 1. And that's the key reproduction number, and that's the critical value for it, when IT plus 1 minus IT is equal to 0. So remember that I'm going to come back to that shortly. Now, let's go now to the value functions that we maximize. The recovered individuals have an infinite life. They maximize their 5 functions that I defined before as being a function of 2 activities, the home and the social. So let's just denote that by phi star, and this comes over the future, and that's the VAR, which is constant. Now, V with a superscript capital I is the net present value of the infected. Now, during the period of their infection, they have negative utility, which we define as a fraction delta of the VR, of the utility of being recovered. And that delta depends on the number of infected people through the medical congestion externality that I talked about before, in that if there are more infected people, then they lose more value. And therefore, that gives you equation 7 as being a fraction between 0 and 1 of VR, and the fraction is lower when there are more infected people. And finally, the all-important susceptible present discounted value of the utilities. The first thing that we have to decide is how to model the transition probability for the single individual, given that I define the contact functions in terms of the average number of activities in the market. And here we just follow the labor literature. It's like a choice of search intensity in job search. Km x of bar is the flow of people, the average probability, if you like, when the activity rate is x bar. If you divide that by x bar, that's the average transition rate for a single unit of x bar. Multiply that by the choice variable of the individual, x of st, and that gives you the transition rate for this individual. We denote that by p of x of s, where x of s is the choice variable, and that depends on x bar as well as other market parameters. It's exactly the way that search intensity is modeled in models of job search without wage dispersion. Now, therefore, the net present value of the susceptible people is defined as the maximum over the excess of the net indirect utility of phi of x hx plus the probability that the individual makes a transition and gets the value of the infected plus the probability of not making the transition and repeating again the value of the susceptible next period, all discounted by the rate R. The first order maximization conditions give us 10 for x of h, so there are no externalities involved there, nothing at all. The individual is able to set the marginal indirect utility of x of h at 0, as in the optimal without the infections, but 11 changes in that instead of that marginal indirect utility being set, net indirect utility being set to 0, it's set to some other value which depends on the difference between the infected state and the susceptible state. I guess that should really be an S, not an R, in equation 11, super V of super S. The equilibrium, this is the definition of equilibrium. We have all the equations that we need now. We have the laws of motion for the big numbers, SIR. We have the three asset value equations, 6, 7, 9. And we have the two first order conditions for x of h and x of s. Now we solve this equilibrium for the symmetric Nash case where each and every individual chooses the same activity, x of s. This is the assumption of no heterogeneity that I mentioned before. And just for notational convenience, I now remove the x bar. And whenever there is an x bar, I set it equal to x of s. And here it is, checking the time, we're okay. The first order condition for x of s gives us that the marginal utility, if you like, is above 0, it's positive, and therefore there is social distancing. That's the definition of social distancing. What that means is that the individual consumes or chooses a lower x of s, and therefore with standard assumptions on the utility function with two goods, the individual is going to switch some activities from the market, from the social space, into the home. That's what we mean by private social distancing. The transition from S to I slows down because of that social distancing, because you can see the key reproduction number, which is the one I showed you before. It's the one that sets so it's the number, given that infected people spend only one period in the infected state, is the same as the average flow from into the eye. Now, if you have a very high S, that necessarily means that you have a very low I because of the constant population, and therefore a high X of S social activity. So that in a way that gives you the maximum number for R. And if that's bigger than 1, that's what we call an epidemic. It's the definition of an epidemic, if you like. If it's less than 1, then obviously there is no epidemic. With respect of COVID, it is high. You know, we're talking about values of 2, 3 at the beginning. But as I rises, then more and more people get infected. The probability of infection rises, and therefore people respond by reducing their social activity. And if you look at 13, that brings down R, not only because the stock of S falls, which is the usual channel through which the reproduction number falls in epidemiological models, but also because people choose a lower X. Now, the disease will peak when that R in 13 will be equal to 1. Again, you see that's what I said to you. Look at when I reaches the turning point. That's R equal to 1. If you recall what I was showing you before. And we call that the maximum number, the highest S at which we get herd immunity. Now, what does that mean? It means that if we manage to get, sorry, let me change it. At that point, the number of infected people doesn't change. If we manage to get the economy to have 0 infected people at that point, then we get herd immunity with the maximum possible number of healthy individuals. And it's possible to do that, as you will see in the simulations later. Okay, these are the basic parameters with which we simulated. We assume a quadratic indirect utility function. For the simulations I'm going to show you, quite critically, we're assuming, although the matching function is defined in general, or the contact function is defined in general to have any returns to scale, the simulations are done with constant returns. It's something that in the future, obviously, we have to generalize. Everything else is, I wouldn't say intuitive, but they are plausible numbers that give us nice graphs that correspond to what epidemiologists are deriving. And here are the simulations. The number of susceptible is falling monotonically. The number of infected people rises very fast in the beginning and then goes down very, very gradually. And the activity that individuals choose is so dependent on I that it's almost a mirror image. It's the third simulation. And the cumulative number of infected people is the bottom graph, which rises monotonically. Now, note that the length of the period is 2 weeks, as I was mentioning. So this is a very, very slow process. We're talking about numbers jumping to 100. Now, 100 2-week period would be 200 weeks, which is about 4 years before we reach, say, halfway. If you look at the bottom graph, that's approximately, it takes approximately 4 years, a little bit under, to reach the midpoint of the cumulative infected rate. Now, next we're doing a comparison with SIR. Now, SIR models, the basic epidemiological model, assumes that X is a constant, which they fix either at some previous parameter, if you like, or at some point that is chosen by the government. Here we are fixing it at the point that maximizes the utility function without the people maximizing, taking into account the probability of infection. So it's as if we have a steady state value for X of S, which will hold under no epidemic. And we're holding that constant when we're doing the simulations, and we're comparing with our simulations. Now, the optimized simulation is the red line, and the SIR epidemiological simulation is the dotted blue line. And you can see this massive difference that we're getting in the time dimension. If you see the second diagram, in fact, you see it much more. This is the number of susceptible people. And in the epidemiological models, after about 10 2-week periods, so after about 20 weeks, almost everyone in the economy, about 90%, get the disease. And that's when we reach herd immunity. In our model, in an equivalent period, about 10% of the people get the disease. But then if you come to the end of the horizon, the limiting case where you have the herd immunity in our model, you can see that there are lots and lots of people remaining in a healthy state. And that's also reflected in the number of infected people, in that the infections in the epidemiological model rise very fast. to get to about 90% the cumulative number of the population, whereas in our case, they rise very slowly. Simply because people are withdrawing from the market. Now, I should say, that it's something that's obvious, that obviously that depends on the parameters. For example, only earlier today, I saw a working paper at the LSE, which was getting much faster adjustment in a model that was very similar to ours by using a different set of assumptions. So that's obviously something we're working on. But the main result that I want you to pick up from here is the fact that with the endogenous choice of social activity, the number of people who remain free of the disease in the limited state is higher. And here I showed USB much higher than in the than without this voluntary social distancing. And but the adjustment to the herd immunity state is much slower. Now, let's look at what the social planner does. Well, the social planner maximizes a value function that is similar to the susceptible value of the healthy individuals, but she maximizes not only with respect to the activities X, but also with respect to the future numbers of people in each state, taking into account the externalities, the increase in retention scale, the medical externalities, and the two dynamic externalities, contagion and immunity, that I mentioned earlier. Full maximization gives you the top line is the one that we get as well from the contact externalities, the increasing retention scale. The second one is the one that is ignored by the individual. What the individual is ignoring is the fact that if she becomes sick, then she will take a bet that someone else could be having. It's the medical externality. Of course, the person here does take into account the fact that when there are many infected people, she will want to withdraw more because she realizes that she won't be able to get this good treatment. But she will ignore the fact that if there is a free bed and she takes it, she deprives it from someone else. The contagion externality comes from the fact that in future, if I choose a high social activity now, the number of infected people in future will go up. And that will reduce the value of the still healthy people because there will be a probability that I will infect them. And the immunity externality comes from the fact that if I choose a high social activity now, in future, the number of susceptible people will go down, and that will lead us to herd immunity faster because the stock of S will be down and there won't be enough homes for the virus to get into and prosper. All this is explained here. That's what I just explained to you using the equations. So we could skip that. And finally, I show you remarkably, it's now 1:39. So I still have 1 minute, Charles, which I'm going to take. The externalities, we just used two examples. The first example is the one of the immunity externality because it's a rather counterintuitive one. That the planner will cut losses and go to herd immunity relatively quickly. But for that to happen is it's a special case, but it does arise. The second one, which is interesting, when we wrote it, actually, we thought it was new, but since then I've seen at least 2 other papers that make the same point. If you expect with some positive probability that will be a vaccine in the future, then you want to impose even more social distancing now, waiting for the vaccine to arrive. Because if you vaccinate people, essentially you are reducing the S number, the stock of susceptible people, and therefore they're reducing the potential homes for the virus, and you get to herd immunity faster. You wouldn't have to vaccinate everyone. In fact, you have to vaccinate only the number of excess susceptible people, if you like. If you know that your herd immunity will be reached at point S star, you vaccinate everyone between S star and the current S in the market. And therefore you wait for that to arrive. The simulations that I've shown you, you saw the shape of the graphs that it takes very long to reach herd immunity, but what we found very interesting, and it's now becoming clearer in my mind, in fact, and my colleagues' minds, obviously, is that the final state that is reached with endogenous social distancing is very, very close, sometimes even coincides with the maximum number consistent with herd immunity. In fact, in other words, people would choose their activity in such a way that the set I will be stationary at 0 value of the stock. And that point exists and is unique and all that. The planner would choose a different social activity. Generally, it would be lower because there are 3 externalities against 1. But interestingly, in the simulations, the social planner will arrive at the same terminal herd immunity state as private individuals, which is, again, maximizes the number of people who avoid the disease altogether. 40 minutes are up, and this is the conclusion that, the main conclusions are the first 4, and the final bullet point is watch this space, there will be more. We're actively still working there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's amazing how far you can go by taking the matching function into.
Oh, it can do wonders, the matching function. Did you know that?
But no, it is really surprising how far you go.
I've written a whole book with the matching function.
Yeah. And also more generally, it's fascinating how economics can improve on the epidemiologist mechanical things. So it's a pleasure to see that. We now have a bit more than 15 minutes for discussions, and there are presumably 3 people to answer. So I will open the discussion. If you want to talk, please raise your hands. And I think Mariolina, who is in the background, will let you in. It's like a normal seminar. Nobody should be shy. Okay.
Thanks, Charles. This is Ugo. Thanks for the presentation. Just so my original intuition was that the closer a vaccine is, the tighter should be the social planner sort of restriction to movement. But I was then not sure because at the end you said that herd immunity is reached at the same time by the social planner and the decentralized equilibrium. So I don't know if you could clarify that.
Yes, no, what the statement I made at the end is a comparison of what people will do in the same environment as a social planner. That result I pointed out, actually, it doesn't have the vaccination possibility, but even with the vaccine possibility, if they both have the same probability of the vaccine arriving, I mean, suppose you know that there is a probability 0.1 that you're going to get a vaccine in any period, or even that you would get it at some specific time in the future, then they will both want to impose more lockdown restrictions now and wait. And once you get the vaccine, then you vaccinate everyone, every excess susceptible person, the difference between S and the S of star of the herd immunity, and the problem is finished, the epidemic has gone. So the comparisons are always the same. What's interesting with the comparisons that I was saying at the end is that the social planner will most likely want to impose more social distancing now, but as t goes to infinity in the limit, they will converge on the same point. So there are many different paths of converging to the herd immunity state in the limit. And private individuals will not choose what the social planner would consider to be the optimal path. I should say that we haven't proved that there is only a unique optimal path. What we've been showing is that it will not coincide with the social planners will not coincide with the private individuals.
If I can ask a follow-up question, and then we have two people waiting to talk, I'll be brief. There's another distinction, I think, between your model and the epidemiologists. The epidemiologists want apparently to reduce or slow down the end of lockdown. And that's something you don't do, but what some studies seem to show is that having been locked down, people are now more willing to be locked down if you want the utility function is changing. So even if we stop the lockdown completely, it's very possible that XS will be even lower than it was before. So the risk of ending the lockdown may be smaller than what the epidemiologists are telling us. I don't know if one of you want to comment.
Yeah, that's very correct, actually, that even if the lockdown is stopped with a homogeneous population, at least, that everyone is subject to a positive probability of infection, people will continue to have social distancing. So as we get closer to the herd immunity state, I suspect the difference between the social planner and the private individual may not be that much. So they might relax it completely and people still social distancing. Now, one interesting possibility there, which we sort of pointed out only informally in a Project Syndicate piece, in fact, is that that will still have a big economic cost on the economy. So the government, thinking as a social planner, might want to bring more people out. You know, it will say, oh, the probability of infection is so low, don't destroy the economy for that low probability. But people, a single individual would think, oh, let my neighbor go out and let them get infected. And then when we get to complete herd immunity, then I will go out too. So they don't go out as much. That's related to the immunity externality I was saying before, which might become more powerful as we get close to the herd immunity state.
I think Pietro wants to come in, yes.
Vis-a-vis what Charles was saying is that the individuals you were imagining, they have sort of an adaptive learning on the process, while our individual here have full rational expectations. And so in some sense, that they don't learn from the lockdown. It is optimal to be in lockdown. That's, I mean, do you agree, Espen and Chris? There is no learning in that sense.
No, in the model that we have now, there is no learning. That is actually something that could be very interesting to look at your learning underway.
Yes.
So, but I think this idea that you are kind of changing the objective function, that you are getting used to behave in a different way, being more careful. That is something that you get in, and that may stay on even if you open up.
Okay, now there are three people waiting. Maybe we collect the questions so all three of them can come in and you guys will answer. We see Riccardo Puglisi
yes.
Knocking at the door. Then we have Elu Fontaden and finally Tito Boeri. Riccardo, you go.
Yes. So thanks for the webinar. So of course I'm sympathetic to rational expectations, and I want to build on that because I think you have to factor in the informational problems, because suppose that people are rational, but the point is that regarding the parameters of the model, well, it happened that we had to change our mind about the contagion in reality. So it's a bit of a case study, because for a while we thought that contagion could only happen because of symptomatic people, And then it turned out, unluckily, that it also comes to a large extent from asymptomatic people. So even if people are rational, have rational expectations, this could play out in the initial phase of the optimal behavior, simply because they optimize on not the correct contagion model.
Okay.
Well, that's the case where the available information is not perfect, like even in the probabilistic sense, and people act on the available information. That it would be a much more difficult model. I think though it can be handled given how much, because it's like you're saying there is a stochastic flow of information. It reminds me very much of the stochastic versions of the matching models. You know, things like Rob Scheiner has worked on, for example, with discrete time and stochastic versions, which would be feasible here as more information arrives about these things. You know, that might be modeled through the K parameter that I was mentioning. You remember that, which is the probability that you actually get infected when you come into touch with someone. And in the case where we think only people with symptoms pass the disease, that we think that K number is very small. When asymptomatic people pass the disease, that K number is perceived to be higher. It's something that maybe not in the next iteration, but in next but one iteration. Okay. Is something that probably could be nicely, actually. It's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating. I'm a little bit, and I'm puzzled a little bit by why it takes so long for these transitions, these private transitions under the decentralized solutions. I would be curious to hear about that, because my impression is that there's a priori a big danger of the public health system and all other agents in the economy to be overwhelmed by the disease. And this is why one needs, at least initially, probably quite strong restrictions, if not a lockdown. But if I see that number that you put up, like it takes like almost 4 years for the numbers to really go up, is that an argument for less public interference and for in quotation marks, laissez-faire, because the social interaction effect is so strong that the disease spreads sufficiently slowly to not create too much damage in terms of overwhelming the system?
I think actually I'm going to let Mike also answer, because you won't be surprised to hear that they have a comparative advantage, if not absolute, when it comes to simulations and shooting algorithms. But they're both smiling, so it's okay. But the main result that I like there is that obviously, as optimizing agents, we're going to restrict our activities, and therefore the rate of infection will be lower, and we're going to adjust the steady state lower. Now, the actual number, though, it shocked me as well. I said to them, "Are you sure you are modeling 2-week periods?" They said, it's 2 weeks because of the way we define it over the eye. It must be strongly dependent on parameters. I don't know if they got any other shooting algorithms with different parameters to work, so I let them volunteer. I don't know which one of you wants to go in first.
Should I say so? So it is a good point, and I must admit that when we first saw this, we first wondered if it was a typo, but it is not. To some extent, as Chris says, it has to do with parameter values. We were putting in here in the figures that you saw a relatively high cost of getting the disease. And then when that cost of getting the disease is high, then really what happens is that people are cutting down so much that the reproductive number is just slightly above 1. So that's why it really takes much longer time. The planner, he uses even more time. So that's the difference typically in the simulations that we have now. The planner will typically cut down even a bit more, and therefore it will take even longer. But that is really, I think that is something that we will find in many simulations, as long as it's really costly to get the disease. Of course, if you don't care about getting the disease, you will just don't cut down at all, and it will just be like in a standard zero model. But as long as the cost of getting the disease sufficiently big so that people start cutting back on their activity levels, then you will get, it will take much longer time.
And I think it's quantitatively is 20% of the lifetime value of a recovered guy. That's how we, so basically it's very bad getting the disease in our example.
Okay, now Tito, your turn.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say congratulate the three of you. This is very inspiring. Yeah, two issues, questions. The first, it seems to me that most of the action comes in on the job creation side. Let's use this term, while not much on the job destruction, but at relatively low frequencies, especially given that all this adjustment is taking place in your simulation over quite a long time period. There is also a mechanism operating on the job destruction side that perhaps should be taken into account, namely the selection of the fittest among the viruses themselves. So the viruses would survive if they don't kill people. So that clearly over time it would select the most efficient virus, those that do not kill people. The second issue is instead about R. This is the key signal that is used by public administration now to tell, to decide upon lockdown measure and other things. From what I understand also from your presentation, this R is mainly a derivative of this contagion function. So can be quite misleading as a signal given to people because it does not really convey the information about the probability of contagion, which is another thing. So I wonder what you think about this as well.
So I think it's very interesting comments. So the first one, suppose that you get selection so that the virus may become less dangerous in the future. So that will actually imply that people will be more, reduce activity level even more today. Because then sort of the value of being susceptible in the future becomes higher, because then it's less costly to get the disease. So therefore, in relative terms, the cost of getting the disease today will be higher. So therefore, people will actually cut back on activity level more when they know that you can get a milder form of the illness in the future. It's similar to a vaccine actually. So yes, and then also on the second issue that you talked about, this reproductive number that they are estimating. So yes, what they are estimating is sort of this the product here of the activity level and sort of the true or pure reproduction number. That's correct, not just the R in itself. Yes, I very much agree on that. So it's a good point.
On the first, I just said a joke. You know, Tito, Chris started with job creation in the 90s. Job distraction came later. So,
unfortunately, Dale is around to do the job destruction side of the model, badly.
All right, wonderful. It's a good way to end. We've reached the end of this time of the hour. I want to thank enormously the authors. This is a great paper, and it shows the power of economics. And we had a good discussion. I know that a few other people wanted to ask questions, but we are really running out of time. So apology for those who didn't have the time to come into the game. And again, thank you very much to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Charles and CEPR, and thank you very much for the work you are doing at COVID Economics. You know very well that I had some doubts in the beginning. You've won.
You had doubts about the title, I thought.
I'm a good loser. Yes, exactly. But I should say that to people who, I saw a number of people who have put off asking questions. I mean, any one of us would be very happy to receive comments via email, because we're actively working on extensions of this model and all that, and anything useful you can share, we're more than happy to see. If you want to keep it secret, write your own paper, cite us, of course, and then we'll see your paper and we'll cite you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.